There's one type of person a narcissist will never forget, one person they'll orbit around for years, decades, even long after everyone else has moved on with their lives. And the twisted irony? This person wants absolutely nothing to do with them. Carl Jung discovered something about the narcissistic psyche that explains why certain individuals become permanent fixtures in their mind, haunting them like ghosts they can neither banish nor possess. If you've ever wondered why a narcissist keeps circling back to someone who clearly doesn't want them, or if you're that person they won't leave alone, what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see these toxic dynamics. Because according to Jungian psychology, this obsession isn't about love. It's not even about control. It's about something far more primal, something rooted in the darkest corners of the narcissistic shadow self. And understanding this might just be the key to finally breaking free. Let's start with what Carl Jung understood about the narcissistic personality that most people miss entirely. Jung didn't use the term narcissist the way we casually throw it around today. He talked about something deeper, the inflation of the ego and the complete denial of the shadow self. In Jung's framework, every human has a shadow, that repository of traits, impulses, and characteristics we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. For the healthy individual, shadow work means gradually integrating these rejected aspects, becoming whole. But for the narcissist, the shadow isn't just ignored. It's violently repressed and projected outward onto others. This is critical to understanding their obsession pattern. When a narcissist encounters someone who refuses to reflect back the grandiose false self they constructed, someone who instead holds up a mirror to their actual shadow, something extraordinary happens in their psyche. This person becomes what Jung would call a carrier of their disowned self. The narcissist quite literally sees parts of themselves in this individual, parts they've spent their entire lives running from. And here's where the obsession takes root. They cannot ignore this person because doing so would mean ignoring the shadow material that's been externalized. They cannot possess this person because true possession would require acknowledging the shadow, which would shatter the false self entirely. So they enter a state of perpetual psychological purgatory, endlessly circling this individual who represents everything they refuse to integrate. The person becomes a living, breathing projection screen for the narcissist's most feared and rejected qualities. Now, who exactly is this person that narcissists become obsessed with? They have very specific characteristics that create this unique psychological trap. First, and most importantly, this individual possesses authentic self-worth that isn't dependent on external validation. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole and separate. The individuated person, or someone well along that path, doesn't need the narcissist's approval, doesn't seek their validation, and remains fundamentally unimpressed by the grandiose false self-presentation. This is absolutely intolerable to the narcissistic ego because their entire psychological structure depends on others buying into the illusion. When someone doesn't buy in, doesn't react with the expected admiration or even the expected fear and submission, the narcissist experiences what Jung termed enantiodromia, a psychological reversal where their conscious attitude flips into its opposite. Their usual confidence becomes obsessive uncertainty. Their typical indifference becomes consuming preoccupation. Second, this person typically has strong boundaries and enforces them without emotional reactivity. They don't engage in the drama, don't participate in the narcissistic supply cycle, and maintain what Jung would recognize as a well-integrated ego-self axis. They're centered. The narcissist, whose entire relational model is based on enmeshment and boundary violation, encounters an immovable object. This person won't be manipulated, won't be guilt-tripped, won't be love-bombed back into the toxic dynamic. And paradoxically, this firm boundary actually intensifies the obsession because it represents the psychological boundaries the narcissist never developed. The third characteristic is perhaps the most fascinating from a Jungian perspective. This person often mirrors qualities a narcissist once had or desperately wishes they had. Remember, narcissism typically develops as a defense mechanism against deep wounding, often in childhood. The grandiose false self is constructed as armor against feelings of worthlessness, shame, and inadequacy. But beneath that armor, there's often a nascent true self that was abandoned long ago. When a narcissist encounters someone who embodies qualities their true self might have developed, genuine empathy, authentic confidence, creative self-expression, emotional honesty, They experience a profound and disturbing resonance. Jung would say this person constellates the narcissist's unlived life, the path not taken, the self that could have been. This creates a toxic mixture of attraction, envy, rage, and longing. The narcissist is simultaneously drawn to this person because they represent what was lost, and repelled by them because they're a walking reminder of the narcissist's own inauthenticity. The obsession becomes a desperate attempt to either destroy this mirror or somehow absorb these qualities through proximity and manipulation. But of course, neither works. You cannot destroy your own shadow by attacking its external projection, and you cannot integrate disowned qualities through manipulation and control. Yet the narcissist remains trapped in this compulsive cycle, unable to let go, unable to move forward. Let's talk about how this obsession actually manifests in behavior, because understanding the patterns can help you recognize if you're dealing with this dynamic. The narcissist's obsession with this particular type of person operates through what Jung called participation mystique, a primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other become blurred. The narcissist genuinely cannot distinguish between their own psychological material and the actual person they're obsessed with. This leads to several distinct behavioral patterns. First, there's a hoovering cycle, those repeated attempts to reestablish contact after separation. But with this specific type of person, the hoovering is different. It's more persistent, more creative, more desperate. The narcissist will show up in the person's life through seemingly coincidental encounters, through mutual friends, through social media monitoring, through flying monkeys sent to gather information. Years can pass, sometimes decades, and suddenly there's a text, an email, a message delivered through an intermediary. This isn't about rekindling a relationship in any normal sense. It's about trying to reestablish the projection dynamic, trying to force this person back into the role of shadow carrier. Second, there's a smear campaign that never quite ends. With other targets, the narcissist might devalue, discard, and move on to new supply. But with this person, the smear campaign becomes an obsessive narrative they return to again and again. They tell and retell stories about this individual, constantly reframing the relationship, casting themselves as a victim or the superior one who graciously gave this person attention. The smear campaign serves a specific psychological function in the Jungian sense. By continuously talking about this person, usually in negative terms, the narcissist is attempting to diminish the power of the shadow projection. If they can convince themselves and others that this person is actually flawed, actually a problematic one, then maybe the disturbing mirror can be neutralized. But it never works. The very act of continuing the smear campaign years later reveals the ongoing obsession and the unresolved psychological conflict. Jung observed that what we resist persists, and the narcissist's resistance to the shadow material this person represents ensures it will continue to dominate their psyche. Third, there's the monitoring behavior. The narcissist keeps tabs on this person's life, checking their social media, asking mutual acquaintances about them, maintaining a detailed internal dossier of their activities and achievements. This surveillance isn't about wanting the person back in any genuine relational sense. It's about trying to maintain the psychological connection that allows the projection to continue. The narcissist needs to know what this person is doing because, in their distorted perception, this person's life is somehow still entangled with their own unlived possibilities. When this person succeeds, the narcissist experiences a confusing mixture of vicarious pride. They unconsciously identify with the success and seething envy. They consciously resent that it's not theirs. When this person struggles, the narcissist feels a disturbing satisfaction, validation that their rejection of similar vulnerabilities was correct, mixed with an unexpected concern that reveals the depth of their psychological entanglement. Now, let's explore why traditional no-contact advice, while generally sound, sometimes fails to stop this particular obsession. Jung understood that psychological projections aren't broken simply by physical distance. The shadow material remains in the narcissist's psyche, whether the actual person is present or not. In fact, absence can sometimes intensify projection because the narcissist's imagination fills the void with even more charged content. When you're not there to contradict their fantasies and narratives, you become even more idealized or demonized, more symbolic, less human. The narcissist relationship is primarily with their projection, not with the actual you. This is why they can seem to know you deeply in some ways, while being completely blind to your actual experience and feelings. They're relating to an internal image, a psychological construct that carries their disowned material. No contact prevents new material from feeding the obsession, prevents new interactions that could be distorted and incorporated into their narrative. But it doesn't necessarily stop the internal psychological process. The narcissist continues the relationship in their mind, having imaginary conversations, creating scenarios, revising history, all to manage the unresolved shadow material you represent. This is actually why many people who go no contact with narcissists report feeling like they're still being energetically harassed, still showing up in dreams, still creating anxiety despite no actual contact. From a Jungian perspective, this makes sense. The narcissist's psychic energy is still directed toward you because the psychological conflict remains unresolved. Here's something that often surprises people. The narcissist's obsession can actually intensify when you genuinely heal and move on with your life. Jung wrote about the concept of psychic inflation, where the ego swells beyond its natural boundaries, and he noted that this inflation requires constant feeding. When you were potentially available, even just theoretically, you served a function in the narcissist's psychological economy. You were the one who got away, the challenge that proved their desirability, the shadow projection that they could theoretically one day reclaim or destroy. But when you actually heal, when you build a life that clearly demonstrates you've not only moved on, but actually thrived, something shifts in their psyche. Suddenly you're not the one who got away. You're proof that life without them is not just possible, but preferable. This is a narcissistic injury of the highest order. Your healing and happiness don't just wound their ego, they fundamentally threaten the false self-structure. If you can be genuinely happy and successful without them, if you can integrate and develop the very qualities they projected onto you while their own life remains stagnant or chaotic, then the entire narrative they constructed collapses. You become living evidence of the path they rejected. The path toward authenticity, integration, and genuine relationship was actually the right one. This is unbearable. So, paradoxically, your visible healing can trigger an escalation. The hoovering attempts become more intense. The smear campaigns become more vicious. The monitoring becomes more obsessive. They might even engineer situations to insert themselves back into your life, creating emergencies, sending gifts, making grand gestures, anything to reestablish the connection and restore the psychological dynamic where they have power. Let's examine the concept Jung called the complex and how it relates to narcissistic obsession. A complex, in Jungian terms, is an autonomous part of the psyche with its own energy and agenda. It operates somewhat independently of conscious control, which is why people can be possessed by a complex and act in ways that seem foreign to their usual personality. For the narcissist, the person they're obsessed with becomes associated with a mother complex or father complex, depending on the original wounding. This person isn't really themselves in the narcissist's psyche anymore. They're an archetypal figure carrying the energy of the original source of narcissistic injury. When a narcissist had a parent who was emotionally unavailable or conditionally loving or overtly abusive, the child learned that love and approval must be earned through performance of a false self. The true self is rejected, buried, becomes shadow. Fast forward to adulthood, and the narcissist unconsciously seeks out relationships that replicate this original dynamic because unresolved complexes compulsively seek resolution through repetition. But here's where it gets interesting. When they encounter someone who refuses to play the parent role, who won't withhold love until performance is perfect, who actually recognizes and calls out the false self, the complex is activated but cannot complete its expected pattern. This person should reject the true self and reward the false self. That's the script. Instead, they're seeing through the false self and potentially valuing authenticity. The narcissist's entire psychological operating system crashes. The complex cannot process this, so it fixates, obsesses, trying to force this person into the expected role. The narcissist might alternate between idealizing this person, casting them as a perfect parent who could finally give unconditional approval, and devaluing them, casting them as the cruel parent who unfairly withholds what's deserved. But notice that both positions keep the person locked in a parental archetypal role, rather than seeing them as an actual peer in an adult relationship. This is why the narcissist obsession often has a quality that feels both romantic and oddly childlike, why their pursuit can swing wildly between seduction and tantrum. They're not really in adult relationship mode. They're in complex-driven repetition compulsion mode. The person they're obsessed with has become a symbolic figure in an internal drama that has nothing to do with who that person actually is. Jung believed that the only way out of complex is through conscious integration, through bringing the unconscious material into awareness and processing it. But this requires exactly what the narcissist cannot do: confront the shadow, feel the original wound, acknowledge the false self as false. So instead, they remain trapped, circling this person who has become the living embodiment of their unresolved complex, unable to let go, unable to truly connect, unable to heal. The obsession is actually a failed individuation process playing out in relational space. What should be an internal journey toward wholeness becomes externalized as a toxic pursuit of another person who can never fulfill the role the narcissist psyche has assigned them. Now, let's discuss something crucial. If you're the person a narcissist is obsessed with, what does this mean for you from a Jungian perspective? First, understand that you have likely developed certain psychological strengths precisely because of challenges in your own history. Jung believed that our greatest gifts often emerge from our deepest wounds. Many people who attract narcissistic obsession have themselves done significant psychological work, often out of necessity. Perhaps you grew up with a narcissistic parent and learned early to develop a strong internal sense of self precisely because external validation was weaponized or withheld. Perhaps you experienced trauma that forced you into premature individuation. Perhaps you're naturally introspective and have always been drawn to depth psychology, self-awareness, authentic expression. Whatever the path, you develop qualities that the narcissist both craves and despises. But here's the shadow side you need to consider. Jung emphasized that we don't just carry our own shadows. We can also carry shadow projections for others. When you're holding the narcissist's disowned material, there's a psychic burden to that. Even if you're not in contact, even if you've done everything right in terms of boundaries, you might feel drained, preoccupied, unable to fully move forward. This isn't your fault, but it is your responsibility to address. You need to consciously refuse to carry their shadow material. This is more than just no contact. It's a psychic disentanglement. It means recognizing when you're thinking about them, rehearsing explanations, imagining confrontations, and consciously choosing to redirect that energy back to your own individuation process. One powerful technique from Jungian active imagination involves actually dialoguing with a narcissist as they appear in your psyche, not the actual person, but your internal representation of them. You might be surprised to find that this internal figure, once engaged consciously, reveals itself to be carrying messages about your own disowned material. Perhaps their criticism actually points to an area where you need to develop self-compassion. Perhaps their inability to see you clearly reflects ways you haven't fully seen yourself. This isn't about blaming yourself for their behavior. They're responsible for their actions. But it is about recognizing that no one enters our lives, especially in such a powerful way, by pure accident. From a Jungian perspective, even the most toxic relationships can be soul teachers if we're willing to extract a lesson and release the teacher. Another crucial practice is what Jung called withdrawing projections. Just as the narcissist projects their shadow onto you, you might be projecting onto them. Perhaps you made them more powerful than they actually are, giving them an archetypal quality they don't deserve. Perhaps they represent your own inner critic, your own internalized voice of invalidation. By withdrawing this projection, by seeing them as a damaged person rather than an omnipotent force, you reclaim the psychic energy that's been bound up in the obsessive dynamic. You stop carrying them in your psyche with the same charge. They become smaller, more manageable, more human. This doesn't mean you trust them or let them back in. It means you stop giving them free rent in your psychological space. Let's address a question that often plagues people in this situation. Why me specifically? Why did the narcissist become obsessed with me and not someone else? Jung would point to the concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. At the moment you encountered this narcissist, both of your psyches were in a particular configuration. You carried something they needed to confront. They carried something you needed to learn. Perhaps you needed to learn to value yourself independently of others' opinions. Perhaps you needed to develop fierce boundaries. Perhaps you needed to recognize your own worth so clearly that no amount of gaslighting could shake it. The narcissist, brutal teacher that they are, provided exactly the crucible for that development. From the narcissist side, you appear at a moment when their false self-structure was potentially vulnerable. Maybe they were at an age or life stage where the performance was becoming exhausting. Maybe they had experienced a narcissistic injury from another source. Maybe some part of their deep psyche was actually attempting a breakthrough toward authenticity. And then you appeared, embodying the very qualities their true self might have developed. Instead of taking the hero's journey toward integration, they chose a familiar path of projection and obsession. But your presence marked a critical junction point in their psychological development, a moment when change was theoretically possible. They chose to make you the enemy, the obsession, the problem, rather than recognize you as a mirror. This is why you specifically, because you arrived at a kairos moment, a moment pregnant with potential transformation. The obsession is a narcissist psyche desperately circling this missed opportunity, this rejected call to individuation. Section 13. Now, what does a healthy response look like when you realize you're dealing with a specific type of narcissistic obsession? First, you must establish and maintain rigorous boundaries, not just behavioral no contact, but psychological boundaries as well. This means developing what Jung called a temenos, a protected sacred space around your psyche. You practice techniques that clear them from your energy field, whether that's meditation, visualization, ritual, therapy, whatever works for you. You stop explaining yourself to them, even in your own mind. You stop trying to make them understand. You accept that they're operating from a completely different psychological structure and that mutual understanding is not possible. Second, you focus intensely on your own individuation process. You ask yourself the hard questions. What did this relationship teach me about my own shadows? Where am I still seeking external validation? Where are my boundaries still weak? How have I been complicit, not in their abuse, but in my own abandonment of self? This isn't victim blaming. It's a profound personal responsibility that comes with Jungian work. You recognize that every relationship, especially the toxic ones, reflects something about your own psychological state at the time. You extract the gold from the darkness. Third, you develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. You can acknowledge that this person harmed you and that you're powerful enough to heal. You can recognize that they're damaged and that you don't need to save them. You can feel compassion for their woundedness and maintain absolute boundaries against their behavior. Section 14. One of the most profound aspects of Jung's work is the idea that what's most personal is most universal. Your specific experience with narcissistic obsession, as painful and isolating as it may have felt, is actually part of a larger archetypal pattern. Throughout history, mythology, and literature, we see the same dynamic. The false self pursuing the authentic self, the shadow stalking the light, the ego obsessing over what it cannot control or integrate. When you understand this, you stop taking it personally in the wrong way. Yes, it happened to you personally. Yes, your suffering is real and valid. But it's not because there's something uniquely flawed about you that caused this. It's because you stumbled into an archetypal drama, playing out a pattern as old as human consciousness itself. In myths, the hero often faces a shapeshifter, an antagonist who keeps changing form, whose true nature is difficult to pin down. The narcissist is a shapeshifter, alternating between charmer and monster, victim and perpetrator, obsessive pursuer and cold dismisser. Your journey is a hero's journey, learning to see through the illusions, developing the strength and wisdom to maintain your truth in the face of constant gaslighting and manipulation. In fairy tales, there's often a moment when the hero must refuse the temptation to look back, to turn around, to return to what's familiar even though it's toxic. Think of Orpheus losing Eurydice because he looked back, or Lot's wife turning to salt. Your task is to keep moving forward, to build a life so full and meaningful that the narcissist obsession becomes irrelevant background noise. Not because you're running away or in denial, but because you've genuinely moved into a new chapter where they simply don't belong. Section 15. Finally, Let's talk about the ultimate paradox at the heart of narcissistic obsession through a Jungian lens. The narcissist is obsessed with you precisely because you represent the path to their own healing, yet they can never take that path while remaining a narcissist. You embody the integration they need, the shadow work they've avoided, the authenticity they've buried. On some deep, unconscious level, their psyche knows this. That's why they cannot let you go. You're the medicine they desperately need but cannot swallow. You're the mirror they must look into but cannot bear to see. And here's the final twist. By doing your own work, by healing and individuating and becoming more fully yourself, you actually become a more potent symbol of what they're missing. Your very existence, your happiness, your authenticity, becomes a standing invitation to them to do their own work. Not an invitation you're consciously extending. You owe them nothing, but an invitation that exists by virtue of you living your truth. Will they take it? Almost certainly not. Genuine change from narcissistic patterns is rare, requiring a level of ego death and shadow confrontation that most people cannot sustain. But it's not your job to save them, to wait for them, or to dim your light to make their darkness more comfortable. Your job, the only job that matters, is your own individuation, to become who you were meant to be before you encountered them, to integrate your own shadows, to develop your own authentic self so fully that their obsession becomes, finally and completely, their problem, not yours. Jung believed that the ultimate goal of human psychological development is individuation, becoming wholly yourself, integrating all the disparate parts into a unified whole. The narcissist's obsession is their failed individuation process made external. Your liberation is your successful individuation process, regardless of their continuing drama. And that, ultimately, is the answer, not how to stop them from obsessing. You can't control their internal process, but how to complete your own journey so thoroughly that their obsession no longer touches you, no longer drains you, no longer matters. You become psychologically sovereign, a whole unto yourself, and from that place of wholeness, you can finally, genuinely, completely let them go. Disclaimer: the content presented in this video is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The concepts discussed draw from Jungian analytical psychology and contemporary research on narcissistic personality patterns. If you're dealing with abuse, manipulation, or psychological distress in any relationship, please consult with a qualified mental health professional. The term narcissist is used here to describe behavioral patterns and is not intended as a clinical diagnosis. Every situation is unique, and professional guidance is essential for personal circumstances.